Above the town of Albert on the Somme, a ridgeline was named after two hills in Ireland. What's the story of the Tara-Usna line? And what do we find at a junk sale in northern France that leads us down some very different avenues of Great War history? I've been privileged to spend a lot of time on the old front line recently, staying at Ypres, visiting Loos, and then spending a week on the Hindenburg Line battlefields of 1917-18. This episode will go out close to the 5th anniversary of the podcast, when we first broadcast an episode about Boisselle on the Somme, just as all of us had gone into lockdown in those now far-off COVID times. And I've often spoken about the path to the podcast, how I'd been meaning to do one for a very long time, and suddenly that moment gave me the opportunity to do it. And I won't go over all of that again, but it's important, I think, even in a small way, to mark this anniversary. And travelling around the last few weeks, I've been reflecting on the podcast and how it has become so much a part of my life in those 5 years that followed the broadcast of that episode about Boisselle. Something I feel not just happy and content about, but also feel lucky that I've been able to find a new way to take what I've done for most of my life and what I've discovered over most of that life and turn it into something that engages others and means something to them on their own Great War journey. I passed Boisselle last week and thought about how even that has changed in the last 5 years with the death of my old friend Christiane Foucault. The Foucaults were a French couple, Yves and Christiane, who I met very early on in my journey across that landscape of the First World War. Yves was then still a Commonwealth War Graves Commission gardener. He joined them as the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1947, and they'd lived in and around Boisselle for a huge chunk of their life and all of their married life. And Yves was not just a gardener in the cemeteries, the silent cities of the Great War, he was a collector of Great War material. And both of them, on top of that, were very generous people and became a big part of my life for a huge period of my life. And they now rest together for all time in the civil cemetery at Boisselle, and every time I take that road through the village and past that cemetery, I give them a nod and thank them really for all the things that they'd given me and my wider family. It reminds me too that none of these places remain the same. They never stay constant. But it also, with the death of Christiane since I first broadcast that episode about Boisselle, reminds me as well that the characters that I've known on the Somme, that older generation who had known it in some cases as far back as the interwar period, that generation is fading away. The private collectors, the war graves gardeners, the fonts of knowledge that were out there, the local knowledge that people had, all of that is fading away. And with it, in the kind of wider interest in the Great War, all of those authors that brought the Great War to a new and expanding audience, people like Lynn MacDonald and Rose Coombs and John Giles, and then latterly in recent times, Martin Middlebrook and Tony Holt, they're passing away. We're losing that. And sometimes I feel that perhaps we don't always acknowledge the contribution that they made. Even historians like John Terraine, who was the original president of the Western Front Association, this incredible author who really changed people's perspective of the First World War. Even those kind of people, and John himself has faded away sadly some years ago now, even they're not as well known as they should be. And I think, to me, it's a constant reminder that there's always work to do, always work to bring the subject of the Great War to a new audience, an existing audience, a wider audience, whatever it is, but to keep that torch, not just a remembrance, but much more than that, to keep that torch burning bright. And it's always good to meet people of a new generation, a younger generation, and it means as much to them as it's meant to me through all of my life. And then while out on those battlefields over these past few weeks, I find myself coming across those crisscross paths of the Great War, many of which we've touched on in previous episodes of this podcast. And while out on the Hindenburg Line, we popped to Cagnicourt, for example, a small little village where part of the main Hindenburg Line ran through there. It's not far from what became known as the DQ line, the Drocourt-Quéant switch line, where the Canadians fought in September of 1918. But in the cemetery there, which does contain some Canadian dead from the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the Canadian Corps, there is also a number of unknown soldiers of the Newfoundland Regiment who were brought there for reburial in post-war concentrations, and they came from the village of Monchy-le-Preux. And of course, last year was the movement of the remains of an unknown Newfoundland soldier from the battlefields of the Great War to be buried in an honoured tomb in Newfoundland. And we covered that in a previous episode, but this was the first time I'd had a chance to go to that former grave, marked now by a special headstone, and see that spot from where that soldier was taken from the battlefields where he fell more than a century ago to be taken home and there remembered for all time. And then not far away, while on the Canal du Nord area, it was interesting to see the first evidence of the work for the new super canal that's going to be built there and how that might change that landscape forever. Again, this is something we've covered last year in the podcast. It's a huge engineering project that will transform that landscape from northern France down towards the Somme River Valley and beyond towards Paris. It'll transform that forever. It'll change the way France moves its logistics around the country. But of course, it will also affect that landscape of the past, of the Great War. And I'm sure that news that will come out of that work, discoveries that will be made, human remains, Great War archaeology, I mean, who knows what will be found when that kind of work is taking place. That will also, I think, help keep the subject of the First World War in the public consciousness. And considering those battlefields cover not just regiments of the British Army and corps of the British Army, but so many other Commonwealth nations, then this is something that will be applicable to a very wide audience indeed. So even in the short lifetime of this podcast, the landscape of the past and present continue to crisscross and continue to change. All of those kind of subjects that we've spoken about still are very, very pertinent when it comes to the subject of the Great War. And this, I would guess, is just as it's always been. If I'd been able in these past few weeks to sit down with those old friends who were pioneers of visiting this landscape of the First World War, they too would have chronicled the changes that they saw in their lifetime. And it'll be true for much of that young audience that I know now listens to this podcast. When you begin your journey, and you may have begun it already, in years to come you will see changes too, and you'll look back on places that you knew which have now gone. Sadly, or perhaps rightly, this is the nature of a landscape that isn't just a museum. It is a place where people live and they work and they go about their lives, which is what I guess soldiers go to war to fight for, so that life and normality and freedom can be restored. And that's a lesson that I think also feels very pertinent in the modern Europe as we know it today. And while I think interest generally in the Great War isn't falling, it isn't as high profile as it once was, for example, during the Great War centenary. And sometimes of late, as I reflect on the 1980s, it does feel occasionally as if the Great War is a little bit in the wilderness. The next Great War, the Second World War, clearly dominates the media, television, publishing, and in some respects, podcasts, YouTube, and so much else. But that, for me, is all more the reason to be telling these stories and not stopping. And I'm sure, and I know that many of you feel the same way. So I'm proud of this podcast, proud of what I've been able to put into it. I often used to call it my confession, and in some ways it still is. This is kind of what I've done for all of my life, a very different life in many ways, but one that I've done because I've always felt that it was my path. And when I look back and had those privileged times where I knew all those veterans, I think that they passed something to me that I couldn't always quantify, and it's only as perhaps I've got older that I've been able to do it and put it into words, verbalise it through some of the things that we've done in this podcast, and I'm sure many still to come. But I'm also proud of the community that we have built through this podcast, an international one that I like to think of as a group of friends, all passionate about the same kind of things. And it's been just wonderful to meet so many of you over these 5 years, both here in the UK and especially so on the old front line itself. And in particular, this time last year, a group of us met and walked the battlefields together in Flanders. And that's certainly something that I hope to repeat in the very near future. But this is a journey that is far from over. For me, it will never end, of course. It will remain lifelong, and I know I'm not the only one who feels that way about the Great War, and I'm sure many of you listening will share those same kind of sentiments. As John Dray, my old friend, and dear old Spags, Tony Spagnoli and John Giles, and so many others used to say, the Great War is a wavelength. And I was reminded of that as the old sun set over the skyline at Boisselle last week. That special view of that special cemetery that I've photographed so often, and a path and a route and a battlefield that I've walked across for most of my adult life. The sun casting its ancient sunlight through the trees of Boisselle British Cemetery, with evening birds filling the landscape air with their song, and that weaving pathway up the hill to the cemetery itself, somehow, as it always does for me, symbolising all of our journeys across that landscape of the past, across those old battlefields. It was quiet still that evening, but also not really quiet at all, because the voices of the past call strongly here. They speak to that wavelength for those who care to listen. And more than a century after so many of them found their journey's end here, and nearly 2 decades since the last voice of that generation left us, these men, their deeds, everything that they stood for, and everything that this landscape of the past means to us today seems just as vivid, just as powerful, just as important. So thanks to all of you for listening over these past 5 years. As I said recently, we are far from done. We're really only just beginning, because that old front line has many, many stories left to tell us. So here's to the next 5 years and beyond. So a bit of a different podcast this week. We'll discuss one part of the battlefields in this section of the podcast, and then we're going to look at a couple of objects I picked up when I was over last week. So starting on the battlefields themselves in this part of the podcast, we're going to go back to that walk that we did a few weeks ago from Albert to Bapaume, where we took the old Roman road between those two key towns, which cut its way across that ground where the Great Offensive took place in 1916. And we're going to pause just outside the town of Albert on the sloping ground which forms a crest and enables you to see a wide area of this Somme landscape. When we discussed this in that recent podcast, I posed a question about the 2 hills that form this ridgeline here, which were named on the trench maps Tara Hill and Usna Hill, and often known as the Tara-Usna line. I asked how did they get their names, and quite a few of you very kindly responded. For example, John O'Connor on email sent, I was listening to the most recent podcast and you queried the origin of Usna Hill and mentioned that Tara Hill was named from a hill in Wexford. I think that both names might actually refer to the more famous hill of Tara in County Meath as opposed to Wexford, and the hill of Usna in County Westmeath. Usna is the Gaelic spelling of the word which was anglicised as both Usnagh and Usna. Both are famous hills in Ireland, as well as burial sites, and important to the history and mythology of Ireland. Just a thought, says John, but given how close they are to each other, I think it's quite probable. So thanks for that, John, and hopefully I haven't murdered the exact pronunciations of those places in Ireland, but that gives us a bit of a clue. And I had quite a few emails like this, and another one from David Keeley, for example, who says, I'm Irish and live in Ireland, so I thought I might suggest a possible origin for Tara-Usna. There is a hill of Tara in County Meath and a hill of Usna in County Westmeath here in Ireland, each of which are historic and officially protected monuments. They are both ancient ceremonial and burial sites and part of Irish mythology. It seems possible that the names may have originated from these sites, given that they are located in adjacent counties just an hour away from each other. Anyway, just a theory, but I thought worth suggesting. So thanks for that, David. And thanks to you all who sent similar kind of comments in. I really, really enjoy receiving this kind of feedback. And it's great because I pose questions in these podcasts and you help answer them. And it's a learning process for us all, which I think is incredibly, incredibly important. So before we get to the naming, I think this pretty much establishes what these hills were named after, but who named them. Before we get to that, what is the wartime geography here? So we've come out of Albert today. There's a big roundabout there. There's a McDonald's. They're about to build a Burger King there, incredibly. There's a KFC. I mean, it's kind of fast food city. But you get beyond the hotel, the Ibis, and there's a little bit of an industrial park there. You've got Bapaume Post Cemetery on the right-hand side, and then the old Roman road climbs the hill to the crest, and then you've got an incredible view just beyond across a huge swathe of that 1916 Somme battlefield. The pre-Somme trench maps, which are secret editions, so those are trench maps that were not meant to be taken into the trenches. They were ones that didn't just show the enemy positions, but they showed the Allied positions, the British ones, with all the named trenches on them. They're incredibly useful for working out what the British layout of the line was in a given sector. Not every map was a secret edition, and most of them just show a kind of outline of where the front line positions were, with often no named trenches on there at all, apart from the German ones. So these maps show the Bapaume Road cresting the rise with Albert behind, and Usna Hill to the left and Tara Hill to the right. Beyond Usna, the ground drops into what was Mash Valley, which ran all the way towards Boisselle, past La Boisselle on the right and Ovier on the left. Very pronounced valley there, which gave the Germans a great advantage. And on the right, Tara Hill had Avoca Valley beneath it, and overlooked in the distance Sausage Valley, which is how Mash Valley gets its name. Sausage-shaped German observation balloon pops up. That becomes known as Sausage Valley, and if you have a Sausage Valley, you've got to have a Mash Valley as well. So this overlooked that in the far distance beyond the village of La Boisselle. But to the immediate right of Tara was another position on the maps, part of that extended crest line there, known as the Shapes Spur, and that's just overlooking the immediate valley and the approaches to the southern part of La Boisselle village itself. The trenches on both hills, when you look at the secret edition maps, they both had Scottish names, like Dundee Avenue, Perth Avenue, Pitlochry Street and St Andrews Avenue, for example. And there were two redoubts here, so circular-shaped defensive positions that were on the reverse slopes of both hills. I suspect they were used as signalling posts, possibly as advanced brigade headquarters for units that were in the line at Overlooking or La Boisselle, and certainly they were used for that purpose on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and no doubt there were artillery observers in there that could get forward to the crest of the ridge and spot for the guns as well. And these were known as the Tara and Usna redoubts, and you can see them very clearly both on air photos of the period and on the secret edition maps. The names Tara and Usna for these two hills and the redoubts only begin to appear in late 1915 maps. If anyone's got an earlier edition than September, October of 1915, which shows these names, I'd be very interested to hear about that. So that could possibly kind of date when the names were given to these two hills. And the trench system here was, of course, French for the first part of the war. The French army fought against the Germans here in 1914. A front line was established, which cut across what became known to the British as Mash Valley and got close to the village of Overlooking. French territorial soldiers had fought there in 1914, and there was tunnelling operations between the French and the Germans in what became known as the Glory Hole to the British. So there'd been a lot of activity before the British arrived, and in this sector, the first unit in the line was the 51st Highland Division in the summer of 1915, who moved down here from northern France and took over these trenches, all of which had French names, and that's how they ended up having Scottish names, because they were the first ones in the line, and they added a lot of the names to the trenches, and those names stuck on the maps, and therefore it was them that kind of named this sector. So Lochnagar Crater, which is of course a crater formed as a consequence of the explosion of a mine there on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, is named that because the tunnel that then led underneath no man's land began in Lochnagar Trench, itself named by the Jocks of the 51st Highland Division who were here in that summer of 1915. And then other units began to move in, principally units from the 8th Division, which was a regular division that had moved again down from northern France to take over this sector, the 32nd Division, that would then move up to near Chapval and be involved in the attack there. The 8th would stay in this sector, and it would be one of the units that would attack alongside the Tynesiders here, who were part of the 34th Division, another one that arrived in this sector in the early part of 1916, and the 8th Division lads would be attacking across Mash Valley on the first day of the Somme. Now, given that the trench system was established by the Highland Division, and as we can see from the information provided by many of our correspondents, that the naming of these two hills clearly link them to places in Ireland, there are no Irish units in the 51st Highland Division. So it can't have been them who named these hills. Well, perhaps not them. There are some Irish units in some of those other divisions, and of course in the 34th Division there was a Tyneside Irish Brigade, but they didn't arrive here until these positions were already known by these names, so it can't have been them that gave the hills their names. I think for a long time, I think that was kind of assumed. But of course we can look at the makeup of a division and we can see its kind of background in terms of the Highland Division where the units were recruited from, and can see no obvious connection to Ireland. But what we don't know, of course, is the background for every soldier, every staff officer, for example, in a division like that. And maps were often prepared by the staff of a division, and the naming of trenches within a sector was often done by them as well. So perhaps in the 51st Highland Division there was a soldier whose background was in Ireland, or perhaps visited those places and they meant something to him and he suggested the namings of it. Perhaps to him it kind of looked like that terrain in Ireland, and that's how the names were given. Now, in the last few days, having checked all of the relevant books, guidebooks, Battleground Europe books, Martin Middlebrook, so many others, as well as unit histories, I looked at all the divisional histories, some of the battalion histories that I've got that relate to this, I can't find any suggestions as to how these two hills got their names. There's plenty of mentions of Tara and Usna and the redoubts and the Tara-Usna line, but nothing that indicates as to who and the why and the when of where that naming took place. So, as with so much Great War research, any kind of research, it often throws up more questions than it answers. But thanks to those of you who listen, I am pretty sure now that we know for definite that they are connected to places in Ireland. And I think that's really important to know. It's micro detail of the First World War, but it is incredibly important. And I think even more important when we consider the history of what eventually unfolded here. So what happened on the Tara-Usna line on the hills here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme? The Tyneside Irish Brigade, with its 4 battalions, together with the 4 battalions of the Tyneside Scottish, straddled the Albert-Bapaume road from the Tara-Usna line, with some battalions in the forward zone and others on the crest of the hill in the positions there. Now, these 2 brigades of battalions of the Northumberland Fusiliers recruited in Tyneside, 8 battalions in total, 4 Tyneside Irish, 4 Tyneside Scottish, POWs battalions, part of Kitchener's army, recruited at the very beginning of the war during that big push for volunteers, but recruited from specific communities within Tyneside with an Irish and a Scottish background. They were part of a division that didn't come to France until early 1916, so they were latterly to the fight, as it were, and had missed the early offensives of the war, and so for them this attack on the first day of the Battle of the Somme was their baptism of fire, and what a baptism of fire it was for both of those units. They were not in the very first wave of the assault. The other brigade of their division, which consisted of the 10th Lincolns, the Grimsby Chums, the 11th Suffolks, the Cambridgeshire Battalion, and the 15th and 16th Royal Scots, that had made the initial assault from Avoca Valley towards the southern part of La Boisselle village, and also around where the Lochnagar mine had exploded, close to a German defensive position that guarded the way to Sausage Valley. The Tynesiders were up on these hills, and you've got to remember that the first day of the Battle of the Somme was what Siegfried Sassoon called that sunlit picture of hell, but that perfect summer's day with perfect visibility for the attackers, but of course also for the defenders, for the German soldiers in their positions. And having been forced underground into their dugouts for 7 days of the bombardment, at 0 hour they emerge and set up their rifle teams and set up their machine gunners. Their artillery and trench mortar observers come up into the positions, and in this sector they see an initial assault coming across no man's land, and they can look up to the hills towards Albert and see that Tara-Usna line, no doubt given a different name to them, but they can see that line, and emerging from the positions there are 8 battalions of Tynesiders, perfectly lit, perfectly visible to the German defenders, and a target which to them would have been irresistible. And as the battle began, those men emerged from their positions. Many of them have got sloped arms, so their rifles on their shoulders, not going into action in the battle position, and they're just walking through the grass over the crest of these 2 hills, the Tara and Usna Hills, and down towards their front line to make the attack on the German positions beyond. And before they've even got down those slopes, before they've taken more than just a few footsteps through that grass, intertwined with no doubt cornflowers and poppies and other wildflowers, the bullets begin to strike, the shells begin to drop, and both Tyneside brigades begin to take casualties. And those casualties in the Tyneside Irish Brigade, as they came down the slopes from that Tara-Usna line, were appalling. Several of the battalions that came down those slopes lost over 600 men. They are listed in Martin Middlebrook's list of casualties that suffered the most on that first day of the Battle of the Somme, and the Tynesiders in particular figure heavily in that appendix to his book, showing the terrible casualties suffered in this open ground on the slopes of these 2 named hills before they'd even got to their own front line. And in 3 of the 4 Tyneside Irish battalions, the commanding officers were casualties, either killed or wounded. In many cases, they were at the head of their men, leading them down these slopes. And also the brigadier became a casualty. Brigadier General Neville Cameron, commanding the Tyneside Irish Brigade, was wounded here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. A brigadier general, a man commanding troops who should have been removed from the fight, perhaps not quite in a chateau, but certainly back from the battlefield. But he knew that this was his lads' first time in action, and they would expect to see him there, and he would want to be there to do all he could for them. And when it all began to fall apart and casualties were mounting left and right, then he could not do anything but be there, and would have not wanted to be anywhere else. And I think this is something that we must always consider when we discuss these senior officers, often seen as cold and detached from their men. But when you scratch the surface and you look at the stories, the truth is often very, very different. But just before the Tynesiders advance, some of these men were caught on camera. And when I was over in Ypres the other week, a group of us were talking about this very photograph and how powerful it was. And I've used that image, for the main graphic for this episode, so you'll easily be able to find it. The official caption for the image reads, "Battle of Albert, the 103rd Tyneside Irish Brigade, part of the 34th Division, advancing from the Tara-Usna line to attack La Boisselle on the morning of the 1st of July. This image was taken by an unknown photographer in the No. 1 printing company of the Royal Engineers. So there were official photographers that were operating on the first day of the Somme, and there were army personnel doing the same kind of thing, but their names sadly not recorded. So I have no idea who actually took this powerful photograph, and it's not a perfect photograph, and often powerful ones aren't. It's taken from quite a distance. The figures are quite small on it. It's not perfectly in focus, but what you can see is a line of men marching forward, again some with sloped arms, moving towards their fate, onwards, ever onwards to that fate, on the slopes of that Tara-Usna line on that sunlit morning of the 1st of July. And when you look at it and you know that terrain, you can picture where it is, and you wonder what the fate of those men were, how many of them came back. Almost all of the men in that photograph would have become casualties, logically considering the percentage casualties of their units. And it's a chilling photograph in that respect. And a couple of Aprils ago, I was leading a Somme tour based in the Ibis Hotel at Albert, which of course is just on the reverse slope of the Tara-Usna Hill. And a few of us one night took a walk up to that Tara-Usna line. Andrew Thornton, who works with me as a battlefield guide, and amongst the others was Louise, who is a great supporter of this podcast. And we went up there because it was, for April, quite a good evening, and we didn't want to just sit in the hotel. Let's get up onto the ground, let's go and have a look at some stuff. And we walked up to that ground, close to where this photograph was taken, and you can see the geography is completely unchanged. Despite some of the modern buildings, the geography of that hill line, that ridge line, is still very apparent, and you can roughly match up where that photograph must have been taken. And when you go up to where the redoubts were in the field, you can see on kind of a field level the traces of the archaeology of those redoubts, the disturbed chalk where the trenches would have been, bits of shrapnel, bits of trench support and things like that. So it all kind of comes together in those layers on that landscape that we often find. And it was incredibly poignant to go up there and think of that photograph, think of the power of that photograph. Like so many images of warfare, unclear, undistinct figures marching into history. And standing there with that photograph on your phone or in your mind, I think it makes it even more powerful to kind of follow it on the ground as it is today. And we walked over to Bapaume Post Military Cemetery, and in there are two of the battalion commanders from the Tynesiders, Lieutenant Colonel Sillery and Lieutenant Colonel Lyle, who, it is said in the 34th Division history, their bodies were found almost at the furthest point where their units advanced by the divisional commander, Major General Ignaville Williams, Inky Bill, a man no doubt shattered by what he'd seen happen to his division in that sunlight on that terrible morning of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. But also buried in there are quite a few men from the ranks of the Tyneside battalions, including unknown soldiers. And it felt, I guess, especially poignant to see them, because the men in that photograph will always remain unknown soldiers, will never know who they were, and that fleeting glimpse of their existence, of their contribution to that black day of the British Army, will be forever immortalised in that photograph. And I guess that is what the old front line is, in a nutshell. A name, a place, an image, a moment, something so powerful that it inspires us to give up our evening, our day, our week to go and explore it. And for me, it's all part of that research that we do for those jigsaw pieces of the Great War, those layers of the history of the past, of that landscape of the past and how it mixes in to the landscape of the present. And for me at least, ensures that the desire for knowledge and the thrill of discovery, well, it never fades along that old front line. So we've walked a bit of the battlefields for this episode, close to the 5th anniversary of the podcast, and I thought it would be quite nice also to look at a couple of objects, because that's something we often did in those early episodes, and perhaps we should come back to that in some way. But when I was over on the Somme last week, staying in Albert, although we were on the Somme battlefields, we were there for a recce, as I've said, looking at the Hindenburg line for a new battlefield tour this year that we're going to be leading. And whenever I'm over there, I always try and see my daughter Poppy, who still lives at Courcelette. And during the week, when we met up, she mentioned that there was going to be a house clearance sale in a village near to Bapaume, what the French call a vide maison. When someone has died, the family often sell the contents to a house clearance company who then sells them locally, and people can go along and buy things. And sometimes that ends up in car boot sales, brocantes, and sometimes it ends up in junk shops, but this was a sale of the complete contents of a house, so quite intriguing in its own right. But the person whose house it was had been a local Great War collector, or certainly a military collector, and it wasn't known how much of his estate was actually military or not military, and it was going to be sold in a large agricultural hangar in this village. So we went along, met up with Poppy, and it was clear that not all of his possessions were military related. There was kind of everything you can think of that could be in a French house inside this hangar, but there was a big chunk of it that was militaria, that was military related. And a lot of the local collectors were there picking stuff up. Quite a lot of it was Second World War, but amongst it I saw quite a few First World War objects. There was, of course, the usual things like helmets and battlefield detritus. There were some caltrops, those old Roman inventions with spikes on that were thrown down, so however they landed there was always spikes poking up, and they were used to disrupt and cause casualties to cavalry, for example, and used extensively in the First World War, not just against cavalry. They often would be left in the bottom of a trench, so when soldiers were attacking, they'd leap up over the parapet, jump into that trench, and drop right down onto one of these caltrops. And there was a few of those for sale, quite vicious looking things, even after more than a century. And there's kind of typical Great War detritus that you often find in these kind of collections. But amongst it are gems. I mean, everything is a gem to somebody. But to me, I'm always interested in the slightly unusual things or the smaller things. And what I found was a piece of carved chalk that almost certainly, knowing where I'm pretty sure it came from, which is down on the Marne, was carved by a German soldier. This was to turn it into the shape of a memorial or a headstone. If he intended to add an inscription to it, that was never done. There's nothing on it. I'll put a photograph of both the objects I'm going to talk to you about onto the podcast website so you can see them. And I know that there was a collector down on the Marne who went into a quarry that was being demolished, which the whole wall of this quarry was covered in these kind of engravings, and he took as many as he could off, and he had so many of them, literally boxes and boxes and boxes of them, that he ended up swapping them with collectors in northern France for things that he couldn't get. And I suspect that's how this had ended up in this particular collector's possession. So that was quite a nice little thing to have. And when I went to pay for it, on the desk where they were taking payments, there was a glass cabinet, and they had some of the nicer things or smaller things in there that they couldn't put out on the shelves. And I noticed an aluminium identity disc, a dog tag, and it's the shape and size of a French one. And given this was a French collector, could well be a French dog tag. But when I kind of peered into the case, I could see RE and RC on the tag, almost certainly Royal Engineers and Roman Catholic for his religion. So I asked to have a look at it. The guy took it out, and indeed it was a British private purchase aluminium identity disc, and it had the name of a Great War British Army soldier on there, 21424, driver J. Smith, RE.RC, Royal Engineers, and he was Roman Catholic. Now, this kind of identity disc was not issued by the army. It was a private purchase thing, and soldiers bought them when on active service in France. I suspect there were a lot of these French-style tags available, and soldiers could go to places behind the lines where French people could make these up for them using stamps, metal stamps, to stamp on the details and then put a little chain on them so the soldier could wear them around their wrist. And this was in addition to their own dog tags, their own identity discs that they wore round their neck. And you might ask, why would a soldier wear two sets of tags? Well, they'd seen what artillery could do to the human body and how soldiers sadly could be literally blown apart by shell fire. And they'd also seen how men could literally disappear. There would be nothing, apparently nothing to bury, and no opportunity to bury anything with a name on it. And I think when you read some of the accounts, it's quite gruesome, really. They had this kind of macabre acceptance that if there was something, at least something with their name on, at least that could be buried. One of the veterans that I interviewed, I often used to ask them about this. He said, well, I buried one of my mates, and all that was left of him was his 2 feet in his boots. And I put that in a sandbag, dug a little hole, put that in, and put a cross up over his grave. So you have soldiers that buy these tags and wear one on the wrist, sometimes one on each wrist, and I've even read about soldiers wearing them around their ankles, so if they took a direct hit, their arms and legs might blow off, and this is just grim to think about, but there would be something for their comrades to bury. That was the kind of reality of being an infantry soldier in the middle of this industrial war, with shells dropping on an industrial scale, causing casualties on an industrial scale as well. So that's the grim side of it. But of course, not every soldier died. Most men survived the Great War, and most men came home. And when I looked up Driver Smith, he was one of those who returned. Now, I don't know the circumstances of this tag being found. It's got chalk and mud on it, so it's obviously come out of a field. And what I've found over the years is that soldiers do lose their kit. They drop things, their wrist snags on something or other, and the chain breaks and the tag falls off. So there can be all kinds of reasons why a soldier might have lost his identity disc, and in this case it's one that he's bought, so it's not army issue and he's not going to get into trouble for losing it, where that might be different with his own fibre tags or a metal tag or whatever it is he's got that was actually issued to him. So that night we sat down in the hotel knowing that he was a survivor. And one of the things, and I'm sure many of you listening to this have found this, when you research Soldiers of the Great War, you can find a lot more about those who died than those who survived, because for the British Army, for sure, so many of the service records and documents were destroyed in bombing in the Second World War. So sometimes, particularly with men who were in corps of the British Army, the Royal Engineers being a massive corps with thousands of men serving in it, it's very difficult sometimes to find anything about them. So I wasn't that hopeful that we'd find out very much about driver J. Smith, considering that his name was J. Smith, which is a fairly common name. But when I looked him up on Ancestry, by chance, by luck, his records had survived. So there was a service record. And I began to look through the pages that identified him as driver John Smith, so we now knew what he was called. And as I flicked through the pages, his story began to unfold, and then with a shock I suddenly saw where he came from, and he was a Barnsley lad. He was from Wombwell, which was just down the road from where I used to live, in Elsica in South Yorkshire. And I often say on this podcast that we don't find these stories, they find us. Something that day was meant to take me to this junk sale. Something was meant to attract my attention as I went to pay for something else and see that tag. And out of all the places this man could have come from, he came from Barnsley. So that was kind of one of those hair on the back of the neck kind of moments when you realise that this is somebody who once walked in a world that you yourself knew. So who was he? Who was John Smith? John Smith was actually born in Ireland, so he wasn't Barnsley born. There was quite a big, and remains quite a big, Irish community in Barnsley to do with mining, and the influx of people to do all the jobs associated with mining and the wider mining community. And he'd moved at some point to work in South Yorkshire, probably in the mines. He's listed as a groom on one bit of paperwork, and a lot of men work with horses in the pits, so possibly that's kind of how he acquired those skills. But he joined the Royal Engineers in April 1911 as a regular soldier, and then did 2 years service, and then went on to the reserve. Now what that meant was he did 2 years as a full-time soldier in the Royal Engineers, and then he was able to leave the Royal Engineers and go back into Civvy Street, perhaps to return to the pit around Barnsley in the coalfields there, and he could go about his normal civilian life. But as a reservist, he would have to do regular training periods, occasionally go on to a camp, and the catch was he'd get paid by the army for this, but the catch was in time of war or in time of national emergency, he could be mobilised and brought back into the army. And of course, that is exactly what happened with the outbreak of war in August 1914. He was mobilised and sent down to Aldershot, where he joined the Royal Engineers there, and was posted to the 2nd Field Company Royal Engineers, which then became part of the 8th Division. Now that was a division that was formed of units that had been brought back from the wider areas of the British Empire. They'd been there on Empire duty, and they'd been brought back to Britain, formed in Britain, and then was sent to France in November 1914. So he went overseas with 2nd Field Company, one of the Royal Engineer Field Companies, one of 3 in the 8th Division that was then sent overseas, and he went on active service in November 1914, so was entitled to the 1914 or Mons Star, as it's often called. His unit then took part in actions on the Western Front. The 8th Division was involved in holding the line around Neuve Chapelle in the winter of 1914-15. Some of its men took part in the Christmas truce during that period, for example, and then in early 1915 they were involved in the fighting around Neuve Chapelle and the battles of Albers Ridge and those kind of early offensives along what we'd now call the Forgotten Front. But driver John Smith wasn't always there to be in these battles. So why was that? Well, let's be honest about it. It's clear from the paperwork that he wasn't a very good or efficient soldier, but he was always in trouble. As early as the 15th of November 1914, so not long after he'd arrived in France, he was awarded 7 days field punishment number 2 for leaving his billet while on duty and drunk. Later, he lost 21 days' pay for being absent from his post for over 10 hours. And in January and May of 1915, he was crimed quite a few times for not looking after his horses in his role as a driver. So a driver in the Royal Engineers was a man who was not driving a vehicle, he was in charge of a team of horses, and he was neglecting his duties as that driver and was crimed for this. Drunkenness and other crimes then continued throughout 1915. His on-active service sheet is full of this, not wounds, not battle scars, not promotions or appointments, but all of the crimes that he was committing on a regular basis. And this continued on into 1916, when on the eve of the Battle of the Somme, when he was located close to Albert, and this kind of ties in with the Tara-Usna line, because the 8th Division, as we said earlier, were attacking across Mash Valley, and being part of that division in the Royal Engineers, he would have been involved in the preparations for the Somme offensive. So he certainly was not very far on the eve of the Battle of the Somme from where we were sitting looking him up on Ancestry. And on that eve of the Somme offensive, the charge sheet reads, he disobeyed a lawful command of a superior officer and refused to mount his horse. Now, we'll never know why he did refuse or what the circumstances of that was, but the army didn't like it. And for this he was tried. This was much more serious. He was tried by Field General Court Martial and sentenced to 6 months hard labour, which was then commuted to 3 months field punishment number 1 at a military prison behind the lines. And this was not any kind of holiday. You would be in full kit, full webbing gear, rifle above your head, and you'd be paraded around and around and around all day long, on and off, by whoever was in charge. You then, when you weren't doing that, be strapped to a wagon wheel or a post for a certain number of hours a day and be given all kinds of other duties, not very nice duties, to perform. So this was a way of trying to correct soldiers who were not doing what they should do and hopefully making them better soldiers when they came out the other side. Did that work with driver John Smith? Well, he returned to his unit still on the Somme front in October 1916 and for a while had good behaviour, and he got home leave in July of 1917, presumably to come back to Barnsley to see whatever family he had there. He was briefly crimed a few months later, but in January 1918 committed the big one. His charge sheet reads, he was charged for receiving, knowing it to be stolen, 700 francs, the property of a comrade. Now this was about £28 in old money at that time, so this is a huge amount of money for an ordinary soldier. He was placed under close arrest. He was tried by Field General Court Martial again, and then given 6 months hard labour in number 2 military prison, again somewhere behind the lines. After those 6 months, and he served the full period, he was discharged from the prison in August of 1918 and spent his last few months as a soldier on active service with a clean record. So perhaps on that second occasion it worked. It pushed him out the other side and he was a better man, better soldier, or if he was doing something, he got away with it. Again, we'll never know. And he was then demobbed in early 1919 and he went back to Barnsley. And we discover that all from one identity tag, one dog tag found in a junk sale in a village in northern France. His own kind of little beacon that John Smith left behind, unwittingly, unknowingly. Who knows what the circumstances of him losing that was, being dragged off by the MPs, fighting with a comrade. I mean, who knows? But it's important, I think, when we research soldiers like that, and his story is far from unique, it's important to understand that not every soldier was what many people now like to call a hero. Heroes come in all kinds of guises, and the complexity of men then is as complex as men today. And when by 1916, as the Battle of the Somme came to an end, the first conscripts arrived, and you've got a conscript army, you're going to conscript all kinds of men, even the early days of volunteers and regulars. Not every man was a good egg, to use a phrase from the time. And this is really important, I think, in our understanding the context of the experience of human beings in warfare and what it did to them and what they were like already and how they tried to carry on that kind of behaviour when they got there. It reminded me of looking at a lot of material relating to this that my old friend Julian Potowski put me onto back in the early 90s, and it's something that I must revisit next time I go to the National Archives. This stuff is not online. There's all kinds of records to do with soldiers being crimed and court-martialed and arrested and wanted. There's kind of police gazettes almost that show who was on the run. There's even photographs, physical descriptions. I think something about crime on the Western Front would certainly make a very good podcast. And I know I'm always promising new subjects, but we will get round to these all eventually. We've not done too bad in 5 years, and hopefully we've got many more years to come. But I think what it shows is that, yes, as we've often said, these men and women, these stories, they find you. You don't find them. And I think that's really important. And on a good week, with birdsong over the landscape of the past, mixing in with the landscape of the present, sunshine casting long shadows across those fields, and the white splash of stone in the soldiers' cemeteries reacting to the light, that early spring light, as the light changes as the evening brings the day to an end. It, for me, emphasised once more how important the sense and joy of discovery remains. It remains so important to all that we do on that landscape, so vital and so fascinating, eternally fascinating, all that we find. along that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.